Uh-oh. Oy vey. Did something go wrong? Did something go wrong? Let's see. I may need to start over. Seems like we're not broadcasting. Please bear with me. I'm trying to get this sorted out. Aha. Okay. There we go. We are live on Facebook. Beautiful. Paula Schmidt-Klauser from Chicago, Lana Coperin from Michigan, James Roth from Indianapolis, Yehudit from Florence, South Carolina, Stephen Giger from Dover, New Hampshire, Marianne Baddeley from Market Drayton in the United Kingdom. Welcome. Tatiana Karina from Ohio, Shalom. Donna Smith, hello from North Carolina. Great to see you all. Now let me just see if we can get this YouTube going. Something seems to be wrong over there. I don't know. I'm just going to have to ignore it in another moment. I did the same thing I always do. Don't you hate when you do the same thing you always do and it produces a different result? Somewhat related to a pet peeve of mine, right? So imagine back in the days when stores were normal and entering a store was a normal thing. You know, let's say that you went to a 7-Eleven near your place of work every day, and you bought a cup of coffee for, $1.50 every day for years. And then one day you come in, you get the same cup of coffee, and they say it's $1.75. And so I'm the type of person that would comment, oh, the price went up 25 cents. And invariably, the person behind the counter would say something like, no, it's always been $1.75. What can you make of that kind of situation? I don't know. I don't know why we are not appearing. Ah, there it is. Okay. Pardon me for being slow. Lynn Job in the house on the YouTube side. Okay. Sorry for all that delay. I'm going to make it up to you with an efficient class. Today's class will not be very long, I don't think. Okay. So where are we holding? Today's class is on page 97, Daf Tzadi Zayin, of Tractate Shabbos, Masechet Shabbos, the second volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 10, and we're still examining Mishnah number 1 of chapter 10. So we're going a little deeper in our exploration of the laws of carrying on Shabbos, the prohibition to carry on Shabbos from a private domain out to the public domain or from the public domain into the private domain. And as we've seen, it is a different matter, but a related matter if you throw an object from one domain to another, or as we saw yesterday, if you pass an object from one domain to another. Today we're going to look a little bit more at the idea of throwing an object from one domain to another, or in the public domain to throw something more than 4 cubits, which, as we've learned before, if you carry an object 4 cubits in the public domain in the absence of an Erev, so then you would have violated Shabbos due to the prohibited labor of carrying. And as we saw yesterday, carrying is unlike the other 38 prohibited labors in that it doesn't really have a productive component. In other words, you don't make something by carrying. Nevertheless, the tabernacle in the wilderness, from which all the prohibited labors are derived, wouldn't have happened. They wouldn't have been able to build the Mishkan, build the tabernacle, if the people hadn't brought the raw materials to the camp of the Levites, where the tabernacle was eventually put together. And that's where we get the original source of carrying. Why is throwing considered a form of carrying and not its own prohibited labor? We learned yesterday that was simply a tradition. It stretches back to Moses at Mount Sinai, that throwing is close enough to carrying that it counts. And it makes sense because you're causing the object to go from one place to another when you throw it. Okay, today we're going to dig in a little deeper on this dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the other sages with respect to throwing an object from one private domain to another. Our situation is, let's say, 2 apartment buildings across the street from one another. And, you're on your balcony on your side of the street. I'm on my balcony on my side of the street. And I throw something. We're not going to say to you, because that might be considered a transfer where I don't cause the object to be set down in your balcony. I'm just going to throw it onto your balcony. Okay, so if we do that, if I throw from my private domain onto your private domain, it goes through the air across the street. The street below us, of course, is a public domain. So in that situation, we learned in the Mishnah that Rabbi Akiva would say, I'm liable for violating Shabbos, because even though I'm going from private domain to private domain, I went through the airspace of the public domain. And the rabbis exempt. They say, I am not liable to bring a sin offering. I didn't violate the Torah prohibition of throwing / carrying on Shabbos. Now, it's important to note that what we're talking here is whether or not one is liable to bring the sin offering for violating a Torah prohibition. In either case, according to both the rabbis and Rabbi Akiva, you've broken the rule, right? You still violated halacha because the rabbis decreed that you should not do this as a fence around the Torah. And so we're always going to be careful to distinguish between a law that's in the Torah, and if you violate that, there's going to be a penalty for it, versus a rabbinic decree, which if you break the rule, you're guilty of breaking the rule, but there's not going to be a punishment for that because the rabbis created these laws for our benefit, to draw a fence around the Torah and to distance us from sin. So let's dig in a little bit deeper on this. Now, if I throw something to you, right? But now it's not the balcony situation. Now let's just say it's a private domain to private domain, and there's a public domain in between. If I throw something low and it goes within 3 handbreadths of the ground, or let's actually start with the easy case, it touches the ground. So let's say that if you're familiar with basketball at all, right? When 2 basketball players who are playing basketball, one can pass the basketball to the other. He could just throw it to him through the air, or he can make a bounce pass, right? So a bounce pass, I bounce the ball off the ground, and then it goes to the other person. If I bounce something off the ground, if it touches the ground in passing from my private domain to your private domain, it's going to go through the public domain. If it touches the ground in the public domain, so for sure I'm liable to bring the sin offering. I have violated the Torah prohibition, because here what I did is I transferred from my private domain to the public domain, and then from the public domain to the private domain. It was actually 2 transfers that I did. So all agree that if it touches the ground in between, there's going to be liability. One is guilty of violating the Torah prohibition. If the object passes close to the ground, but it doesn't touch it. So now it's like you can almost imagine a paper airplane that has little flaps in back. So if you toss it low, it'll come back up. So I'm throwing this object. It's going to go low. It's going to go near the ground, but it's going to soar back up without touching the ground. Okay, so in that case, there's a little bit of disagreement, but most opinions are going to say that is not most. Some will say, and Ramban, who's a medieval commentator, he's much later, but he's going to say that there are opinions in the Talmud that cite this way, that if you come within 3 hand breadths, okay, so this is a tefach, is a hand breadth, the width of my hand. So 1, 2, 3. You know, a hand breadth is maybe 4 or 5 inches, so it's 3 times that, so anywhere like 12 to 15 inches. If you come within 12 or 15 inches of the ground, there's a principle called lavud, attached. So the idea is if you come that close to the ground, it's like you touch the ground. Why is 3 hand breadths the definition of coming close to the ground? Because the ground is uneven, right? Especially in the old days, you know, people were setting up tents and houses, you know, in fairly uneven ground. The roadways were not nicely paved the way they are now. If you live in certain parts of the city, there's such potholes anyway that the road can be quite uneven. And so, you know, it's like it's not going to be an even surface on the ground. So since there's going to be high points and low points all over the place, the sages just used as a definition that if you're within 3 hand breadths of the ground, it's like you touch the ground. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. If you throw the object more than 10 hand breadths off the ground, okay, so now we're talking about 40 inches, anywhere from 40 to 50 inches, let's say, depending on whether you call it 4 or 5 inches for a hand breadth, more than 10 hand breadths above the ground, all the rabbis are going to agree you're exempt. You didn't really do anything in the public domain except fly through it. You didn't interact. The thing that you threw, you know, over the public domain really didn't interact with the ground at all. And so all the rabbis are going to agree that there you're exempt. You violated the rabbinic prohibition. You shouldn't throw something from a private domain to another private domain across the public domain, but you're not guilty of violating a Torah prohibition. So below, touch the ground, for sure you're liable. 3 hand breadths or below, probably liable. 10 hand breadths or above, definitely not liable, definitely exempt. So the question is between 3 hand breadths, 3 tefachim above the ground, and 10 tefachim above the ground. Now we have arrived at the dispute between Rabbi Akiva and the sages. The sages say above 3 tefachim is the same as above 10 tefachim. You're not interacting with the ground. You didn't transfer something to the public domain. You just incidentally passed, above it. Rabbi Akiva says, actually, between the 3 tefachim and the 10 tefachim, you're close enough to the ground that is the airspace through which we would consider as if the object came to rest in the public domain. But the rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Akiva, and the law, the halacha, follows the rabbis who disagreed with Rabbi Akiva. I think it's worth noting in passing that, you know, in the hierarchy of great rabbis, Rabbi Akiva is up there. Some would say the greatest of all the rabbis. Certainly you could put him in the top 5, right? So I don't know if he's the GOAT, right? The greatest of all time, of the rabbinic sages of the Talmud. But for sure, he'd have a good claim to being in the top 5 of many hundreds of rabbis whose rulings appear in the Talmud. And he was held in that kind of esteem in his lifetime. As we learned before when we covered the story of Rabbi Akiva, he had, depending on who's citing and how you count, anywhere from 12,000 to 48,000 students. His rulings appear everywhere in the Talmud, and they're considered absolutely authoritative. He's just an incredible, incredible genius. We even had the story that the soul of Moses came down from heaven, accompanied by God, and went to visit Rabbi Akiva's classroom, where he was expounding on the hidden mysteries of the Talmud. Of the Torah, right? So the Torah was written by Moses, taking dictation directly from God. But 1,000 years later, when Akiva was teaching the Torah, and even God said, "Oh, it's incredible what Akiva is doing. The secrets that he's unearthed in my Torah, they're beautiful and they're all true and they're amazing." And Moses went to Akiva's classroom and heard the lecture. He's like, "I don't get it. I can't follow it. I don't understand it. I don't understand what he's saying." And so Moses turns to God and said, "Maybe you should have had him bring the Torah to the Jewish people. Why me? I can't even understand what this guy's talking about." And then Akiva said, and one of these, and how do we know these things? Because we have a tradition that stretches all the way back to Moses at Sinai. So Moses was sort of, assuaged, right? His hurt feelings were assuaged that he couldn't even understand the Torah as it was being taught by Rabbi Akiva. But certainly the sages were giving Moshe Rabbeinu, our teacher Moses, tremendous respect. The point of what I'm saying now is Akiva is in such high esteem. You might think that, okay, so when Akiva speaks, the law follows Akiva. So no. No, our sages are not going to accord anybody that much respect a priori that whatever he says goes. They will always look deep into the law and say, what is your reasoning? What are your sources? How are you getting there? What is the situation? What is the case? How will this apply in a different situation, etc.? And so he's held in the highest possible esteem, but higher than the esteem for Akiva is the esteem for truth and for understanding the truth of God's teachings in God's Torah, right? So we don't elevate any human higher than that. And it's something worth remembering when we think about leaders, who sort of grow arrogant in their position, that, any authority that people have, any respect that they've earned, it's for the purpose of serving the community, and the needs of the community are going to come first before even any pedestal that we would elevate a great leader upon. And here we see that the sages disagree with Rabbi Akiva on this matter, and the law follows the other rabbis, not Akiva. Okay. Okay, now we have a very specific exception. As we've said, it is from a Torah perspective, you're exempt from bringing a sin offering because you didn't violate a Torah prohibition. If you throw something from I throw something from my balcony to your balcony across the street. But it's prohibited by rabbinic decree, right? So there's not going to be a penalty, there's not going to be a sin offering, but we don't do it because it's prohibited by rabbinic decree. And rabbinic decrees have the strength, they have the force of halakha. The penalty is different, but we follow rabbinic decrees just like we follow Torah laws. That is the nature of Judaism. That's how Judaism works. We have an exception to the rabbinic prohibition of throwing from one balcony to another. But the circumstances where this exception applies are very narrow, very specific. So, when is it not only not a violation of a Torah prohibition, but in fact it's not even prohibited, it is permitted, right? So these are the steps, right? You're liable to a sin offering or you're exempt to the sin offering. It's prohibited rabbinically or it's permitted. So here we have something that is permitted. The final extreme would be, something that is, that is, it's either prohibited or permitted in certain cases or obligated. We're certainly not talking about something that's obligated. But here we're going to talk about something that's permitted even rabbinically. It is permitted to throw an object from one balcony to another on Shabbos if, here we go, this is how specific the situation is. If, one, I'm throwing from a balcony to a balcony that are about the same height, right? So it would be like a second floor balcony to a second floor balcony. Number two, both balconies have to be more than 10 tefachim, 10 hand breadths above the ground of the public domain. Number three, it's a balcony to a balcony. It's not going to be like a balcony to a parking lot, right? Number four, the balconies, I said already, they're at the same level, right? It's like second floor to second floor. You couldn't be throwing from like the fifth floor to the second floor. They need to be at about the same height. Number 4 is the balconies have to either be owned by the same person, right? Like, well, I live in my apartment on this side of the street, and I own the one on the other side of the street. Maybe I, use it for my visiting guests, or, my mother-in-law lives there, or even I rent it out as an Airbnb, but I own it. So I own both of these private domains. Or it's 2 different owners, but they have joined their courtyards so that it essentially becomes one property. The 2 balconies are one property. And finally, the object that I'm throwing is so fragile that if it falls, right? If I don't reach the other balcony and it falls on the ground, it's for sure going to break. And so I'm not going to bother to go down and retrieve it. If it's something that I would go down and get, it's valuable and it's, sturdy enough that if I dropped it from this height, it would not break, then I can't do it. So that's why I made the title of today's class, Let's Have an Egg Toss. So an egg seemingly would qualify, because if I throw the egg across from me to you and it drops, okay, it's going to break. I'm not going to go down and pick up that broken egg. So if all of these requirements are met, then it would be permitted to throw an object from my balcony to your balcony. That's a lot of requirements. I think it's almost like they're teaching us this case to tell you it's so unlikely you're going to meet all these requirements, so don't do it, right? I think they need to show this case because they need to break down the law and say, well, exactly what are the reasons why we can't throw from one place to another. And then if we meet if we can disqualify all of those reasons one by one, it's owned by the same person, the thing is fragile, I'm not going to go down and retrieve it, it's not likely to be broken because the balconies are on the same level, etc. So then we can do it. But I think it's really a reverse example. They're telling us that it's that difficult to meet the requirements, as if to say, so don't do it. Don't throw from one balcony to another on Shabbos. Okay. We mentioned before that if something comes within 3 handbreadths of the ground, so it's considered as if it touched the ground. It's a legal fiction that if it comes near the ground, it's as if it touched the ground, and that's called lavud, that it's attached to the ground. And so how do we know that? Why is that 3 tefachim? Why wasn't it 2 handbreadths or 4 handbreadths? Why 3? So one of the sages suggests, well, 3 handbreadths, right? So 12 to 15 inches, that's the kind of a gap that a goat can squeeze through. Like if you're going to make a fence to keep a goat out of, a trough where it's going to go eat things that you don't want it to eat, so you got to make sure that it's less than a 3 handbreadth gap between that wall and the ground. And then the other sages say, yeah, no, that's not where we get the definition. Makes sense, but that's not a source for this. Why do we think it's 3 tefachim? Less than that is considered attached to the ground. This is another tradition that goes back to Moses at Mount Sinai. That's where we get the definition within 3 handbreadths of the ground. And indeed, when we build our sukkahs during the holiday in the fall of Sukkot, right? So during Sukkot, we build these boots, these temporary and somewhat fragile outdoor rooms that are covered with skach, meaning like usually made out of palm branches or bamboo slats, something that grew in the ground but is no longer attached to the ground, that shades us from the bright sun during the day, but still has gaps in it that we could see stars at night. And we try to have all our meals in the sukkah during the 8-day holiday of Sukkot. And some people, and it's ideal, even sleep in the sukkah. Okay, so when we're defining a sukkah, and we're going to spend a lot of time on that, God willing, when we get to tractate sukkah, or Sukkot, to tractate Sukkot in the Talmud. We're going to talk a lot about the definitions of what is a valid sukkah and what is not. But one of the rules in that tractate is that the walls of the sukkah have to come near the ground. How near the ground? Less than 3 tefachim. So that definition ends up getting used in a lot of different places. And finally, the final point we're going to make today, and then we'll open up to comments and questions, is has to do with throwing and intentionality. So just to be clear, again, if I carry in the public domain, now I'm talking about in the public domain, if I carry an object 4 amos or more, so an amma, and the plural is amos, is a cubit, right? A cubit about 1.5 feet from elbow to forefinger of an average person. So if I carry something 4 cubits or more, it's considered tantamount to transferring from one domain to another. I become liable for violating the Torah prohibition of carrying on Shabbos. So now we know also throwing is like carrying. So if I throw an object more than 4 cubits in the public domain, I'm going to be liable for violating the Torah prohibition on carrying. So what happens if I intend to throw an object 8 cubits, so that would violate the Torah prohibition, but it doesn't go 8 cubits. It only goes 4 cubits. So it's still going to be the minimum measure to become liable for violating the prohibition. But it wasn't what I intended to happen. I intended to throw it 8 cubits, and it only went 4. So the sages are going to say, well, you're liable. Of course you're liable, because nothing can go 8 cubits without going 4 cubits first. So the fact that it only went half the distance it's still wrapped up within the same intention. I was going to throw it in this direction, 8 cubits. For it to go 8 cubits in that direction, on the way, it's going to go 4 cubits in that direction. And this is considered analogous to a person who intended to write a name, a whole name. And the example here is Shimon. Sometimes Shimon, Simon, sometimes spelled Simeon. And you can see why when you see it spelled out in Hebrew. That is a name with 5 letters in it. So if I'm intending to write the name Shimon, which has 5 letters, and I only write the first 2 letters, Shin, Mem, right? So we've learned before that in terms of the biblically prohibited labor, biblically prohibited on Shabbos, of writing, if you write just 1 letter, you're exempt. It was not significant enough of writing for you to be liable for violating Shabbos. But if you write 2 letters, you're liable. You did it, right? So now you're guilty of violating Shabbos. So if I intended to write 5 letters, well, there's no way I can write 5 letters without along the way writing 2 letters. So even if I only wrote 2 letters and I didn't realize my intention, I certainly am guilty of violating Shabbos. Why is this even a question? It sounds weird, like, well, he was intending to do something that would definitely violate Shabbos. He didn't realize his full intention, but he still met the minimum measure for liability, so why wouldn't he be liable? And the answer is the next case. Now we look at the next case where somebody says he intended to throw it 4 cubits, and instead it got away from him a little bit, and it went 8 cubits. So now you're thinking, well, he intended to throw it 4 cubits. That would violate Shabbos. It went even further than that. It went 8 cubits. Why wouldn't he be liable? And the answer is he's not liable. According to the sages, he's exempt. Why? Because in this case, his intention was not realized. Right? He was intending to just throw it 4. It went further than that, but he wasn't intending that it should go out that way. The thing that ended up happening was not his intention. And so here the sages are going to distinguish and say, yeah, the thing that he intended to do would be a violation, but that didn't happen. And the thing that ended up happening was something that he didn't intend. So he did not have an intention, which he then realized. And it's kind of odd. It feels counterintuitive to me because, okay, you know, what ended up happening was a violation. What he intended to happen was a violation. But what he intended was not, was not real. What ended up happening is well beyond what his intention was. And for that reason, they're going to say that your intention matters. And in that case, where he only intended to throw 4 and it went 8, he's not liable. And so it's not mentioned here in our daf, but it seems to me if his intention was to throw it 2 cubits, which would not be a violation, that's something that does not meet the minimum measure, and it seemingly would be okay, and it ended up going 4, which would be a violation. So in that case, I think he'd be exempt for the same reason that if he intended to throw 4 and it went 8, he would be exempt. The caveat that the sages mention here is, well, if when he was throwing, he didn't care where it landed, he did not have an intention in mind of how far it would go. He just threw it, and wherever it lands, okay, then he's definitely liable because he didn't know how far it was going to go, but it was certainly possible that it was going to go the minimum measure for liability, and they will hold him liable for that. But where you have a clear intent that it should just go to there, and it goes well beyond that, so then something happened that you did not intend, and the sages excuse you for that. That's what I've got for us today. Let me see if we've got some questions or comments I should answer. So Martin Mendelsberg says, the nuanced technical measures have always befuddled me. I always seek spiritual metaphors. Can you help me understand the reasoning beyond physical measures? I mean, Martin, it's such a good question and such an important question. And we're going to encounter so many measures along the way that it's tough. You know, it's tough. But my first journey through the Talmud, what I used to tell myself is, you know, when it would get that technical, I would think, wow, look at the passion of the sages to understand God's will at the most granular level. It's important to them. So let me see if I could just sort of put aside my impatience, which I felt many times, but I'm going to endeavor to put aside my impatience and just follow the argument. And let me see if in following it and sinking myself in it and really concentrating, and sometimes it's hard, like you just get lost in it, but if you can just stay in it, then you kind of almost transport yourself a little bit, you know, into the Beis Midrash, into the study hall with the sages where they were trying to understand, and then you can kind of tap into their passion for knowing God's will. That's one approach. Another approach is to search for the takeaway. I mean, here, with this idea that seems so counterintuitive that, you know, the guy intended to do something which would be a violation of Shabbos, he ended up doing something that was bigger than he intended, which was also a violation, but he's exempt because what he was trying to do wasn't realized. I mean, there's other areas where the sages tend to be much more stringent than that. And they say, like, well, you should have been more careful, you know? And so, like, it's almost like, why are they going out of their way to excuse this guy? And I'm just thinking aloud now. I don't have a sharp answer for you, but it seems to me that kind of principle is going to be really important in criminal law. Right? When we're talking about what was the intention of somebody who committed a criminal act, and you know, unfortunately, or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, in ancient times and according to Torah, they didn't have the option of imprisonment, right? So there was monetary damages so that there could be restitution. There was lashes, which is a painful and public punishment. And there was the death penalty. They didn't have that many options. You they didn't have imprisonment where they could say, oh, okay, we'll give you 30 days, we'll give you 6 months, we'll give you 10 years. So they just had to be very careful about where they're going to go, like the massive escalation from lashes to the death penalty. And they're going to be so cautious about that they really said, a court in ancient times which imposed the death penalty more than once every 70 years was considered a murderous court, right? They were so careful, so reluctant to impose the death penalty. But what they were trying to do is with their policies to lift up the whole community and to get people, to care and to conduct themselves like mensches. Not always possible, for sure. And over time, things, really got worse and worse. They got worse and worse in the First Temple period, to the point that we lost the right to have a temple. The people behaved so badly that the First Temple was destroyed. Eventually, we got a second choice. We had a Second Temple period. It lasted about 400 years, but things got worse and worse and worse and worse. And eventually, we lost the right to have a second temple, and we lost it. It's been 2,000 years, and we're still waiting for the temple to be rebuilt. It's very difficult to legislate and to lead in order to create a just society. But it's certainly something that we need to endeavor to do and to figure it out how to do it. And, sometimes these very technical laws can actually move us forward in understanding where right and wrong lies, where justice lies. But it takes that much attention and focus. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy, Martin, and it's a great question. Lena Koperin says, can you explain what determines an Eruv and how it is set up? Does Eruv mean there's no separate private domains? Okay, so I don't have the exact technical language for it. The basic concept is that we have our private domains. Our property. You have your property, I have my property. But let's say we do it. Los Angeles has one of the largest Eruvs in the world. And so it's going to join together a whole bunch of neighborhoods. How do they do that? It's basically using a physical structure that's going to create a joined courtyard, right? So the original Eruvs, and we're going to be discussing this actually in the next tractate, right? I think Eruvin is next. Eruvin comes next after Shabbos. And we're going to discuss how you can join two courtyards, how you can join an alleyway and a courtyard by putting a beam over them and creating a kind of like a passageway. But then the sort of maximum efficiency for joining large areas together, and what's done today, is that they'll string fishing line, like almost invisible, but it's but strong fishing line across like light poles. Right, so if you in LA, if you drive on Western Avenue, you can see the Eruv, and it's just most people never notice it because it's so it's just like a transparent nylon string that is running along the light poles. Sometimes crosses the street, goes back across the street. It zigzags quite a bit actually on Western Avenue. So that's the eastern edge of the Eruv in LA. I don't know, it goes south as far as, I'm not sure how far south it goes, maybe Venice, maybe Pico. You can look it up, Los Angeles Eruv. And then everything that is within the Eruv is considered to be basically like a joined courtyard. So you can carry within the Eruv. But not even today, not everybody holds by the Eruv. Most people in the Chabad world will not, I don't mean the sort of the guests who come to Chabad houses, but the Chabad rabbis themselves, people who, are Chabadniks, not necessarily a rabbi serving in a Chabad house, but living in the Chabad community. This is definitely not universal, but a lot of people in the Chabad world don't hold by the Eruv. A lot of people outside the Chabad world don't hold by the Eruv, so they will not carry on Shabbos. And so even though we have a long-standing Eruv here in Los Angeles, people who don't hold by it when they go out on Shabbos, they won't carry keys in their pocket, for example. So they've got combination locks, mechanical combination locks on the doors of their house, as opposed to an electronic combination lock, which would cause a light to go on during Shabbos, and that's prohibited because making electric light go on is related to kindling a fire. So that's basically what an Eruv is, but it takes a lot of work first to create it, and then there has to be somebody in charge of, on a regular basis, checking out the whole Eruv, so to make sure that for some reason that strong fishing line, sometimes it breaks. And if the Eruv is broken in any one spot, then the whole Eruv is invalid. And so it used to be that here in LA there was I don't know if there were more than one location, but certainly there's a Jewish school called Yavne, and they used to have a flag in front of the school. And if it was green, like the Eruv is intact and you can rely on it. People would drive by on Friday to see if it was red. Eruv is not intact. We don't have an Eruv. You can't rely on it. Now I think that's done, but it's online. There's a website. I forget exactly what it is, but it's something like LosAngelesEruv.org, something like that. So that's the basic idea of the Eruv. James Roth says, how do you know if it's rabbinic or biblical? You got to look it up. You just have to look it up. These days, it's because we are learning Torah for Torah's sake. Which, remember this, that is considered a super, super elevated value, right? That when you're learning Torah, not just to know whether you can or can't do something, not because you want to impress people with your Torah knowledge, but literally when you're learning Torah Lishma, when you're learning Torah for the sake of learning Torah, that's a way of coming close to God. And understanding these days the difference between a rabbinic prohibition and a Torah prohibition is in many senses just learning Torah for Torah's sake, because we don't have the possibility of bringing a sin offering if we violate a Torah prohibition. So whether we violate a Torah prohibition or a biblical prohibition, sort of behaviorally is not going to make that big a difference. If we consider ourselves pious people, we're going to be very dedicated to making sure that we follow both sets of laws. It's not going to be that different. But there are going to be certain differences. One thing to understand is the rabbis will make a decree to make sure that we don't end up breaking a Torah prohibition. But they won't make an additional decree to make sure we don't violate a rabbinic decree. They don't pile up decrees, right? So the approach to which law is which. But if you're not sure, you got to look it up. One thing that's worth having in the house is a Shulchan Aruch, right? So this is the code of Jewish law, as it's been set down for the purpose of following the law. So this is the code of Halacha, so that you can follow the law, so that you can know what's permitted and what's not permitted. This is Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. That's one of the collections, meaning it's Kitzer is a person who did a commentary on Shulchan Aruch, or did edited Shulchan Aruch his way. The Baal HaTanya, the founder of Chabad, Shneur Zalman, he also did a commentary on Shulchan Aruch. And what's nice these days, we live in the internet age. If you have a question about halacha, you could almost always Google it. There's actually something called Halachapedia. There's a lot of places where you can find what the law is. One thing to be careful of when you're looking up a halacha, a Jewish law, online, is who is giving the ruling. Because there's definitely going to be differences between an Orthodox ruling and a non-Orthodox ruling. And if you're considering yourself an Orthodox Jew, then you have to make sure that you're looking up the law according to Orthodox sources. Brandon Christian Sullivan says, is the penalty for all Shabbos violations capital punishment? No. Right? And remember that in terms of capital punishment, like there we just want to understand that, okay, stoning is the punishment for a lot of them, not for all of them. It isn't necessarily stoning. There's other ways to impose the death penalty. But it's very important to notice that it's not like 2,000 years ago, they were executing people right and left for not following Shabbos. It just about never happened. And the sages really, they made decrees on this. It doesn't say in the Torah that in order to be found guilty and the death penalty imposed on you, that you would have to be warned that if you do that, you're going to violate a Torah prohibition, and then you do it like within a few seconds of hearing the warning, and there were two legitimate witnesses who saw this whole thing, and everybody comes to court, and even then they're probably going to find some way out of it. It's not like they were looking, to be the religious police and and impose draconian penalties on people for not acting in a pious way. It just wasn't like that. So much more, these rulings are like, understand what the law is, understand what the Torah said, and even, understand, right? Like in terms of Shabbos violation, actually, if you do it intentionally, if you violate this intentionally, it's actually usually not death at the hands of an earthly court. It's death at the hands of the heavenly court, right? The problem is that you don't get to bring the sin offering in the same way as for an unwitting violation. But again, there's a lot of nuances here, but it's not about, slapping people with terrible penalties. It's about understanding what is permitted, what is prohibited, what is obligated, why, what is it compared to, and the nuances of the different cases. And finally, Lena Koperin says, can you please clarify, if you want to throw something in the forbidden zones and it falls short, then you're not exempt. If you want to throw it to the permitted amount and throw it farther on accident, then liable. So wait, let me get it right. Can you please clarify, if you want to throw something, there's not a forbidden zone. You're talking about a prohibited distance, right? Or prohibited to transfer from one domain to another. There's actually a discussion in today's daf that we didn't get into where you threw something, let's say, from the private domain to the public domain. It landed in the public domain, and then it rolled more than 4 cubits. And did you do 2 violations there or just 1? And there's going to be some disagreement on that. But this idea that if you fell short, it's included, right? So the analogy that they're doing is you wanted to write a 5-letter name. It's prohibited to write on Shabbos, right? So one of the things that we don't do on Shabbos is write. We don't type. We don't write with a pen. We don't write with a quill. We don't write anything. Like the minimum measures that we've talked about, that if you're carrying a piece of food but it's less than the volume of a dried fig, so it's not significant enough, you're not liable for violating unless this piece of food was bigger than that. Likewise, the minimum measure for violating the prohibition on writing is to write 2 letters. So if you only wrote 1, you're exempt. But now you were planning to write a 5-letter name, you knew that you were going to write 2 letters en route to writing 5. And so even if you stopped at 2 letters, you've met the minimum measure, and though that wasn't your intent to write 2 letters, you intended to write 5, what happened was included in your intention to write 5. You knew you'd be writing 2 on the way to 5. However, if you intended to throw 4 cubits, that's the minimum measure, but it went 8 cubits, so the thing that ended up happening was not something you contemplated doing. Now, it seems to us, I think, as a matter of common sense, but you intended to do something that was illegal, and then what resulted was illegal. But what resulted was a different, transgression, as it were, than the one you intended. The one that resulted was not included in your original intention. And so the rabbis are going to, sort of use that lever to find the person exempt and not cause them to bring that sin offering. And remember that when they're letting you off the hook, there actually is also a public interest policy that is being furthered here, because it's not easy to bring a sin offering. For a person who's pious, who has enough money, to make that trip to Jerusalem. In the old days, it was a big trip, right? I mean, if you lived 300 miles away or even 100 miles away and you were walking, that was a big journey, right? And then you had to bring the offering, which would cost you money. And if you're a laborer and you don't have that much money, it could end up being a beautiful and holy and transformative experience for you if you wanted to go do that. But if you're forced to do it, or you're going to live under this feeling of guilt for a long time until, you can undertake that journey. So it was something that the sages would rather not impose on people. They'd rather tell you, okay, you violated a rabbinic decree, but they're going to look for ways out of holding you liable to a Torah violation, right? They're going to look for leniencies. They're going to be more stringent on rabbinic decrees and a little bit more lenient in finding transgression at the Torah level. Okay, that is what I've got for us today. Let me just check one more thing. That's what I've got for us today. My holy brothers and sisters, I hope this learning is valuable to you. This one's going to take a little thought to grasp it. But if you just stay with it, a lot of these ideas, especially the counterintuitive ones, they don't make sense right away. But if you just stay with it, after a while, they start to make more sense. And maybe tomorrow we'll make some more progress on that. We're going to be discussing on Daf 98, page 98, how the beams of the tabernacle were transported in the desert. And that's going to be a little bit... it's a little bit colorful because we're going to feel like we're in the wilderness with the children of Israel and moving from one encampment to another. With God's help, tomorrow's Friday, so the show will be earlier, probably about noon Pacific. And then we'll just be, so happy that Shabbos is approaching and we're slipping into that Shabbos peace.